Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start right on time, but there's a lot of prefatory stuff in here. So anyone who trickles in late will still get a lot of the substance. I heard some Chicago talk over here. Is that right? I lived in Chicago for 8 years and never once had a snow day. And then I moved here, and it's just all the time, it feels like. So I'm glad you braved the snow. I almost walked here, but at the last minute decided to drive, and that was probably the better choice. I was probably more likely to make it. But it's wonderful for you to join us in person and also online, especially given the weather conditions. But we are carrying forward with this series on religions of the world. Last week, I did some introductory things, and this week, our topic is going to be Hinduism. So we'll do one tradition a week for the next 3 weeks. I just want to remind everyone what the goals are for this series. The first is to examine key teachings, stories, rituals, or practices that are connected with a particular religious tradition. Today, it'll be Hinduism. And also to consider how each tradition might challenge or enlighten us as Episcopalian Christians who are seeking to love God and our neighbor. So the neighbor part is easy. There is a Hindu Association of Northwest Arkansas. I don't know much about them, but just a reminder that a lot of what I'm going to talk about, of course, you have your own social networks and that kind of thing, but a lot of it feels, like it comes to us from around the world or the other side of the world, and it does, but we have many Hindu neighbors right here in Northwest Arkansas. Also, just a reminder that we'll be walking, as I described last time, this feels very Episcopalian or Anglican to me, walking a middle way between the two dominant ways of talking about religion. One, especially datable to this book called The Religions of Man, published in the 50s, really tries to emphasize how all religions are essentially the same. And then a more recent publication, God is Not One, by a man named Stephen Prothero, tries to emphasize the strong differences among the world's religions. So when I say a middle way, I am going to emphasize the things that are different and distinctive because I think those are the things we can learn most about ourselves, and also ways that we might grow. But I'm also going to try to make connections to Episcopal Christianity because I think there are things within these traditions that are challenging, but also very illuminating about some of our own practices here at St. Paul's. So Prothero, I ran through several of the major differences that Prothero identifies among the world's religions. So if I were to give the most simplistic possible snapshot of Hinduism, this is what I would choose. So Prothero has this model of every different religion is sort of aimed at solving a particular problem in the world or in human nature or whatever it is, and they offer a solution to that problem. So in Hinduism, if we were to identify one sort of problem, it would be this cycle of rebirth and re-death. Some people describe this as reincarnation or rebirth, but I've been taught to emphasize that to some people that might sound terrible. To others, it might sound great, right? Like maybe I'll get, another life after this one in a new body and new experiences, right? Rebirth tends to sound a little bit positive. But the cycle also involves death over and over and over again. So it's not a positive thing that you would want to be caught in. So the name for that derived from Sanskrit is samsara. The solution then is moksha, which means release from this cycle. So death without an additional rebirth. All right, so that's described as liberation, release, or using this term moksha. But what I'm going to emphasize most of all today is 3 core things that I think have had challenge as well as value for me as an Episcopalian Christian. So the 3 things that I'll focus on are the transmission of the Vedas. The Vedas are the earliest sacred texts within Hinduism. And then the fact that there are multiple paths to moksha, that is release, and I'll talk about what some of those paths are. And last of all, goddesses, right? Hinduism has goddesses. We Episcopalian Christians don't have goddesses. Or do we? That'll be the last one. All right. Okay. So last time I also mentioned some principles for avoiding generalizations, which I'm always going to try to do, right? And I brought up these principles, but really there's no religious tradition, I think, that embodies these principles as much as Hinduism. So the first principle when I talk about any religious tradition is that religious traditions are internally diverse, meaning no one Hindu person is exactly like another, right? They have disagreements, internal diversity. Also, religious traditions change over time. So if you were Hindu 3,500 years ago, you might participate in fire sacrifices, right? And today you might not. You might offer a candle to a deity or a light to a deity. Religions change pretty significantly over time. And lastly, religions are embedded in culture. Hinduism in particular is one of these traditions that there's not a clear, like if you told me today, Laura, your talk was so inspiring. I think I want to be Hindu after all. Thanks for all you've done for St. Paul's, but I'll go for Hinduism. And there's no real way to do that, right? Now, I know people who have married into a Hindu family and sort of adopt Hindu practices and customs and beliefs and all that kind of thing. But other than that, there's not really it's so embedded in culture. I've talked to Hindu people who say there's no way for you to be, even if you wanted to be a Hindu, you can't do it, right? Because you're not of a particular cultural background. So this is a strong case of religion being embedded in culture. All right. So the most important set of prefatory remarks I can make about Hinduism as a whole, before I get into those three specific things that I'd like to explore as being a value for Episcopalian Christians, is that sometimes we think of two models of religion. So one model is probably especially familiar to those of us who are most familiar with Christianity. That's the tree model of religions, where you have a founder who recruits followers, and communities grow and expand and branch off from one another, right? So trees have roots. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily come out of nowhere, but we have Jesus, rooted in Jewish culture, and he recruits disciples, and gospels are attributed to different of those disciples or other followers, and then we get communities that break off from each other: Protestants, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, Western Christendom, all those kind of things. So that's pretty familiar to us. But there's another model of religion that we sometimes call the river model. Now here, there's no founder, there's no sort of essential teachings that things branch off from or grow because they interpret it. Instead, there are many sources of a religious tradition that are diverse from each other, and they develop into a coherent religious tradition over time. So I'll tell you what I mean by that by way of an analogy. I'm from California, right? So imagine that someone, an anthropologist, an imperialist, whoever it is, wandered into California and said, a lot of people here do things that look religious to me. I'm going to describe all those things, and I'm going to call that Californianism, right? So if I made that decision, I'd say, if you practice Californianism, you wake up early in the morning, and a really strong ritual for the bold is to immerse yourself in cold ocean water at sunrise. That's what Californians do who practice this religion. They also like to build tall buildings as a way of worshiping God and honoring God. Some women like to wear veils over their heads, right, as a way of expressing modesty, and they often worship separately from men. Again, more pointy buildings. They love it. And some women, though, wear considerably less clothing and participate in bodily exercises as a means of spiritual growth. Now, we all know, and if you don't know, obviously the first picture is surfing, then we have the Crystal Cathedral, which was a famous, broadcast their worship services. We have the Women's Mosque in the LA area, and we have Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints Temple in San Diego, where I grew up, and then we have a picture of some people doing yoga. Now, most of us know, there's no religion called Californianism, right? These are all different religious traditions, and to lump them all into one thing is to give a very misleading account of how coherent a religion Californianism is. Well, this is exactly what happened with Hinduism, right? So you get people who are not of the Indian subcontinent exploring, learning about these various cultures, and they say, everything that happens within this boundary that we're going to call Hindustan, that's Hinduism. Right, so traditions that had no relationship to each other, different cultural traditions, different practices that may or may not be religious, depending on how you define that, got thrown together into something that gets labeled Hinduism. All right, does that kind of make sense a little bit? Okay, cool, all right. So over time, though, Hinduism has developed into a tradition. Now, part of that has to do with the nation-state of India and all kinds of things. But mostly I want us to have in our minds this river model of religion, where you get different sources and inputs that may not have been connected to each other in a meaningful way originally, but they get synthesized and integrated into something that now we call Hinduism. Okay, there's no Mr. Hindu who started Hinduism, if that makes sense. All right. Okay. So Hinduism is decentralized. There's no founder. There's no creed. There's no primary leader. There's no systematic process for conversion. All right, so we're talking about a very decentralized religion. Now, as for the sources, so I'll talk about some of the things that flowed into the river that is Hinduism. These include devotional traditions, that is, traditions that are focused on the worship of a specific deity, a specific god, right? Renouncer traditions. So these are practices of abstaining from food, abstaining from washing, abstaining from material success, leaving one's family, right? So these we group together as renouncer traditions. And then there are popular local traditions. So it may be something that was done in a particular village that eventually became transmitted or spread to other traditions. So I just have a couple images to reinforce this, and also to kind of replicate what I did with the Californianism slide. I think this is an Indonesian man worshiping Hanuman, god who appears like a monkey. This is a renouncer or sannyasi. So if you go to a Hindu country, you might see, I was surprised. I thought this was a really rare thing, but lots of people like this is sitting outside of temples, don't cut their hair, wear the same simple clothing, although usually with this saffron color over and every day, renouncer traditions. And then this is the best image I could find of a local goddess. Many communities had smallpox gods or smallpox goddesses who specialize in warding off smallpox. But who also eventually got kind of absorbed into what we call pan-Hindu deities. So you might have a local goddess, and then you learn about the goddess Durga or the goddess Kali, and you come to see your local village goddess as a manifestation or a different form of this larger goddess. Does that kind of make sense? So it kind of gets more theologically organized, right? That you have local deities who get associated with larger deities, more popular deities. Sometimes as the spout, like, my local goddess is another wife of Shiva or something like that. So local goddesses and gods get integrated into pan-Hinduism. So those are some of the streams, but we also, to use another metaphor, we also can get different layers of Hinduism. So I'm going to take us through like 3,500 years of history here real quick so we understand some of these developments over time. The earliest layer of what we sometimes call Hinduism or sometimes called Proto-Hinduism in this case, is Vedic religion, usually centered on a priestly class making sacrifices through fire, usually of animals, in order to gain things like prosperity, fruitful crops, or specific rewards. Then we get what's sometimes called the classical tradition from about 800 to 100 BCE. This kind of includes the year 500 BCE that some scholars treat as like just a magical era, roughly called the Axial Age. So this is when the Buddha lived. This is when actually Second Temple Judaism coalesced, we could say. But it's a time when we think people developed a strong interest in two things. One is the belief in the transmigration of souls. It's kind of a technical term for reincarnation. Okay, so in the Vedic period, there's not strong evidence that people believed in that, but it's pretty widespread interest in the transmigration of souls. And they became much more curious about the nature of reality. Is reality real? Is reality an illusion? Is divine reality identical to myself or my soul? They became interested in these questions. Right, so that's what we call the classical tradition, classical Hinduism. Then we get the Bhakti tradition coming up into the Middle Ages. This is a tradition of devotion to particular gods and goddesses. Then we get the Hindu Renaissance. All right, so famously in 1893, Swami Vivekananda spoke at the World's Parliament of Religions and really presented this public image to the world of Hinduism as universal and as tolerant. So many of us have that image in our minds of Hinduism now. He founded the Vedanta Society of New York. Right, so it becomes the public image of Hinduism. And then, of course, there's Gandhi and the movement for Indian independence. So again, a lot of people, because of Gandhi, associate Hinduism with tolerance, universalism, and also the ethic of nonviolence as well. So of all these layers, the Bhakti devotional tradition is the most popular today and probably what most Hindus practice. That is, practices of devotion directed at a particular god that they have some affinity with or that their family is connected to. That is the most popular. So I like this slide because it shows you that while that's a dominant form of Hinduism today, it's not the oldest form. And it's not the only form either, that it's kind of a medieval practice that has developed over time. But when we think of Hinduism, sometimes that's what we're most likely to picture. So as Hinduism became more intentionally cultivated, integrated as a coherent religious tradition, it developed lots of these well, I would say Hinduism has lots of numbered lists, okay, that integrate a lot of these different historical layers as well as kind of inputs to what we consider Hinduism today. So I want to give two examples. I'd say four, because the first one is the 4 stages of life, okay? So this is pretty common understanding of a Hindu life, the shape of a Hindu life. So the first stage would be as a student. Now this doesn't mean like learning math and your letters or anything. It's a student of a particular thing, that is understanding the Vedas. That is 4 ancient hymn collections plus literature related to them. These are the hymns that would have been chanted by priests during those sacrifices in the Vedic period. The next stage would be as a householder, where the emphasis on your life would be being married, having a career, and supporting people who are in the other 3 stages of life. Then you have the stage of a forest-dwelling hermit, all right, where you detach from the worldly concerns of a householder, right? Your goals switch, not from having children or having a career, but you slowly let go of some of those goals. And then become a renouncer, a sannyasi, that is someone who works to achieve moksha now. Stop indulging in the impermanent things of the world, practice meditation, practice forms of yoga. Some of them even join a monastic order. And I have to say, this actually really accords with medieval Christian models of religious life, that people get married, they have kids, and then they retire to monasteries, right? The husband and the wife. It's very common. So that would be a 4-stage model that incorporates different aspects of Hinduism. It includes the renouncer elements, but it puts them at a later stage of life. Another group of 4, we have the 4 aims of life. Dharma would be one of them, that is performing one's duty. There are lots of It could involve the ethic of nonviolence. So for some, it includes vegetarianism, but doing your duty. Kama, enjoying human experience and the sensual aspects of life. Some of you may have heard of the Kama Sutra. All right, that's Kama means pleasure. Artha, pursuing wealth and social prestige, supporting your family. And then moksha, that is turning inward to contemplate the nature of the Atman. That's another name for soul. All right, so over time, Hindu thinkers, Hindu writers, Hindu teachers, Hindu practitioners have found ways to integrate a lot of the elements and historical layers of Hinduism into kind of a more intentionally coherent religious picture. Now, I want to emphasize that not everyone goes through all 4 of those stages in a single lifetime, right? And you can kind of think, if you had to simplify, again, the picture of Hindu life, you might say that there are 2 tracks of Hinduism. One track would be that your aim in this life is to generate positive karma or do other things so that you can achieve a favorable rebirth, one that would be more conducive to achieving moksha. All right, so I could say, I'm not going to make it all the way to moksha in this life. It's already too late for me, right? And I'm like, but what I am going to do is do the best that I can so that when I'm born next time, I might have earned a rebirth that has just better conditions for me pursuing spiritual things, right? So that would be one track. And then the other track would be to use this lifetime to achieve liberation from the cycle of rebirth and redeath, right? Like, I'm committed to making this rebirth and redeath my last, right? And so I might want to really emphasize renunciation in this particular time, or make sure that I get to renunciation, or make sure that whatever path I am on, I really throw myself into it to such a degree that this is it, all right, that I'm not coming back, all right. Okay, so that's my kind of big picture of Hinduism, again, following the river model, going from lots of diverse traditions that become more intentionally coherent over time, find ways to integrate, and also to emphasize that kind of 2-track approach to rebirth and redeath. So I'll move now into my 3 favorite things for Episcopal Christians. The first is the transmission of the Vedas, that is, how these sacred texts are transmitted. So the Vedas, as I mentioned, are hymns and mantras that are chanted in Sanskrit during sacrificial offerings. Okay. They include story, narrative as well, but it's mainly poems, songs. The texts were composed, we think, this is a rough estimate, between 1500 or around 1500 BCE, but they were not written down until the 9th century, CE. All right, so let your minds be blown for a minute. Do the math, right? So these are transmitted orally for all that time, right? It's only later that they're written down. And part of that is to protect them, and they're transmitted not just to anyone, but within particular families and lineages of Brahmins or priests. And to ensure that they're transmitted precisely, they have different chanting techniques. So I'm going to introduce you to one of those, which is called Jatapata. So this is how it works. You pronounce 2 words of the hymn in the correct order. Then you repeat those exact same words in the reverse order, and then you repeat them in the correct order. All right, I'm going to give you an example, so don't worry. Then you pronounce the second of those 2 plus the next word in the correct order, then reverse order, then correct order. So you are never going to lose track of what those words are. I remember doing this when I was learning piano. Like, I'd play a piece kind of phrase by phrase the reverse way, so that I would just never forget those individual units. So let me give you an example. If we wanted to make sure that our descendants never forgot how to call the hogs, we would teach it to them this way: woo pig, pig woo, woo pig, pig suey, suey pig, pig suey, and then that'd be it, right? All right, that one's too easy. What about this one? The Lord, Lord the Lord. Lord is Lord, Lord is my is my shepherd, shepherd my shepherd. Shepherd I shepherd, shepherd I shall I shall not, shall not want not want. All right, so if I wanted to pass on the 23rd Psalm in the King James translation, right, this is what I would have to teach, my family or, priests, priests in training, all right. So I want to play a quick video because I just want you to get a taste for this mixing metaphors there, mixing senses. But let's see if I can get out of this real quick. What this sounds like. So I won't play this whole video. Oh, okay, thank you.
The Hindu Vedas comprise a vast corpus of Sanskrit poetry, philosophical dialogue, myth, and ritual incantations that were developed and composed in India by the Aryans over 3,500 years ago. Regarded by Hindus as the primary source of knowledge and the sacred foundation of their religion, the Vedas embody one of the world's oldest surviving cultural traditions. The Veda is derived from the Sanskrit word Ved, meaning knowledge. The Vedic heritage embraces a multitude of texts and interpretations that are collected in 4 Vedas, commonly referred to as books of knowledge, even though they have been transmitted orally. Veda is an anthology of sacred hymns. The Sama Veda features musical arrangements of hymns from the Rig Veda and other sources. The Yajur Veda abounds in prayers and sacrificial formulae used by priests. And the Adana Veda includes incantations and spells. This also provide an extraordinary historical panorama of Hinduism and offer insight into the early development of several fundamental artistic, scientific, and philosophical notions, such as the concept of zero.
All right, so I just wanted to give a little sound. This video actually does go into how to do it, but I'll stop it there. Yeah, okay. Sorry, we already did that. Great. Here, I'm not going to go through this, but I just wanted you to have an image of a particular Veda. This is a famous one because it is, mostly I just want to see how it's formatted like a hymn, the lines like poetry. And it's a famous one because it's the origin of the caste system. So a lot of people I find have questions about that. This line, let's see, it's about Purusa, the cosmic person who has 1,000 heads, 1,000 eyes, and 1,000 feet, and becomes a sacrificial victim to the gods. And verse 11 here, you see they divided the Purusa into portions, and from his mouth we get the Brahmin caste, that is the priestly caste. From his arms, the kshatriya, the warriors. From his thighs, the vaishyas, the merchants or the people. And the shudras come from this person's feet. So the origins of this model of society are as ancient as the Veda. Caste means color. I just went through these 4 main castes. And then, of course, we have outcasts, that is people who don't have a caste, and to do some of the lowest labor. There's also another term, jati. It means birth because there are subcastes within each varna, which is the caste, which also means color. There are jatis, which are particular births. So within the Shudra caste or within the untouchable caste, there are other jobs like butcher, shoemaker, etc. And each varna, that is each caste, has its own dharma or duty to fulfill. I always like to tell this story. This is me in Nepal, and the guy with the guy right next to me was born in a village in Nepal, and his last name was Khudgi, which meant he was of the butcher class, which would be a low class. And so he moved to Kathmandu, the city, and he just changed his last name to, it's the other way around, Khadga, and he changed it to Khadgi because that was just a common surname. So while there are many horrific things about the caste system, Gandhi, of course, was a great critic of the caste system. In his experience, he's like, I just moved to the city and changed my name, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But also, there was a Jesuit priest whose last name was Sharkey, just a guy from Ohio, right? He was white racially, and his last name was Sharkey, but Sarki, and SH and S are used interchangeably a lot, means cobbler. So he was supposed to go stay in a village with the family, and they found out his last name was Sharkey, and they said, no, he can't come here. And we said, well, he's just a, American guy. But anyway, so it's sort of, very live as well. All right. So when I think about the transmission of the Vedas and Episcopal Christianity, the challenge to me is how important is the exact transmission of sacred text in an original language? And I think a lot of us treat it important in theory, right? But it's not really in practice, right? We have lots of translations of the Bible. I don't memorize biblical passages hardly ever, especially not now, right? Because I can just go look them up, right? So it challenges me to think, maybe that's something I don't put importance on, and why, But what I find illuminating is the power of chanting to mark a text as sacred, right? So I know a lot of you guys were just at the 8:45, so you didn't chant the psalm. So I'm sorry, but but if you ever want to chant a psalm, right, you can do it at the 11 o'clock. So to me, chanting it it's kind of difficult, right? The music can be tricky, right? So learning tricky chanting formulas, right, I think can have a value within Episcopal Christianity, and you don't really find it in other forms of Christianity. All right. So the second thing I really wanted to get to is that there are three main paths to liberation or to moksha within Hinduism. One of them is, I know this looks weird, it's just a convention, Gya, a character that's pronounced Gya, is transliterated into English as a JN, but it's Jnana Marga, the path of knowledge. So you want to achieve moksha, that is liberation from the cycle of birth and death. You could try the path of knowledge, but it's really hard. It's the steepest path. It involves the study of sacred texts, the practice of meditation, and gaining insight. It's not just head knowledge, right? Insight into the true nature of your Atman, that is your soul, that is the part of you that is reborn, according to this view, in successive incarnations. That's too hard, right? You can try karma marga, the path of action. And this is more than just doing positive things. Like we use karma to be, you do good things, you get good karma, you generate good karma. It's a way of acting in the world, but without attachment to rewards for those things, right? If you generate a lot of good karma by being nice, you're going to be pulled right back into samsara because you have some rewards coming to you, right? It's kind of paradoxical, right? I get to the end of my life and think, man, I was so good, I was so generous. And they're like, yes, you just earned rebirth as a queen or whatever. I'm like, dang it, I thought I was done. So you can't just, do good things because then you're still part of the cycle, right? You need to be rewarded for the good things you've done or punished for the bad things you've done, right? So the karma marga path is to act in this world, but with kind of the disposition of a renouncer, right? You do good things not for the sake of reward, but because it's your dharma, it's your duty, right? If that's too hard, you can try the path of devotion to a deity. This, as I said earlier, this is the most widely practiced, and you gain liberation by devoting your time and energy to a deity rather than to your own individualistic desires and concerns, right? So it's kind of like, I think of this as the shortcut in a way. All right. So just to go in a little more depth with the jnana path, the key terms there are Atman, of course, this is the undying soul or self that moves from body to body through cycles of reincarnation, rebirth, and redeath. The Brahman is divine reality, and the source of all being and knowing. And so if you're on or emphasizing the jnana path, you might belong to a philosophical school, which don't all agree with one another. So I'm going to put a slide up here of three main philosophical schools for those who are emphasizing this jnana path, not for you to take it on or write it down, but just for you to know that there is a range of traditions here. And what you're really deciding and trying to learn is the nature of the relationship between the Atman and the Brahman, which people disagree about. So Advaita Vedanta is the non-dualist understanding, that is, divine reality is not separate from the rest of reality, and the Atman is identical to the Brahman. But I can't just tell you that and have you say like, oh, I've achieved the jnana path, right? You have to come to direct personal experience of this in order to achieve moksha through the jnana path. All right, so there are other ones too, and the world in this view is an illusion. Everything is deceiving me now into not seeing myself as identical to divine reality. But once I get that, and it's really hard to get that knowledge, then I would be released from moksha. So here, I'm not going to talk about these. I just want you to know that there are other ways of thinking about the relationship between Atman and Brahman. So karma marga, I mentioned already, it's sometimes one of the best representations of or discussions of it is in the Bhagavad Gita. Some people have heard of the Bhagavad Gita, which is why I mention it. So it's a portion of a larger epic in which Krishna, who's disguised as a kshatri, that is someone of the warrior caste, as his charioteer right before a battle, has a little conversation. And so the guy about to go into battle is worried about all the negative karma he's going to generate in this battle, fighting a war against people who are his kinsmen. And so Krishna, again, as a god, gives him this advice. He says, your dharma is to be a warrior. That's what you're in this for. So go do that, but do it without attachment to whether you're going to win this battle or not. And so that I think of this as kind of a trivial analogy as like going through life with Teflon against karma, right? Like don't let the negative and positive consequences of your actions attach to you. And I will say I think about this a lot as a parent. That's my chance to practice the karma marga, right? The karma yoga is to do my best by my children, however they turn out. Right, if I'm only parenting them so that they'll go into a certain profession or visit me when I'm old, that's not practicing karma yoga. I think about this attitude a lot, as a path. His little quote for him. Anyway, all right. Then we get devotion, right, which arises in South. This is the third of those paths. South India. 12th century, we get a flourishing of this tradition, and then we get lots of medieval and early modern North Indian devotional poetry written in Hindi to the gods. So I'll take a second to introduce, I'm going to go through this very quickly for a purpose of giving, it's like a whirlwind tour of the Hindu pantheon, right, which is diverse and wonderful. Lots of Hindu gods and goddesses. Brahma is the creator, although I think there's only one temple in all of India. It's interesting. He doesn't have a strong devotional tradition. Vishnu and Shiva do. The most popular divinities are Shiva, Vishnu, the goddess Devi, and Ganesha, remover of obstacles. I'll skip some of this. All right, there's the Trimurti of those three gods. So here's Shiva with his queen, Parvati, a goddess, and their sons, Ganesha and Skanda. Ganesha is the one who has an elephant-type face. Here's some other just artistic representations of Shiva. Vishnu, all right, another one of those gods. Vishnu has lots of avatars, one of which is thought to be the Buddha by devotees of Vishnu. Ram is the famous avatar of Vishnu, and his wife Sita is an incarnation of the goddess Lakshmi. So a lot of these develop relationships to each other. Krishna is a famous god. Bal Krishna, it means Krishna as a child. So wonderful images of him and stories about him. Here he's stealing curds. And he has lots of female companions, some of whom are pictured in the other image. And Ganesha, this remover of obstacles, is pictured on the wall here. Right. There are lots of ways to express devotion. Through puja is the word for worship, which is conducted in the temple as well as at home. A lot of people have shrines in their homes. You express devotion by repeating the names of these gods, by singing hymns to them, by offering incense and flowers, by this practice of darshan, which involves sacred seeing, so you gaze at an image eye to eye, and you can offer fire and light. I really recommend this short film. You can get access to it on Disney Plus if you have it. It's a short, like I said, but it's called Sanjay's Super Team. And in one image, you see the dad is about to ring his bell because he's going to do puja at home, and his little kid doesn't want any part of it. He's watching his TV show about superheroes, but eventually he comes and sits next to his dad, and he has kind of a revelation that these deities can act in his life kind of like his superheroes. So it's a sweet story about also different generations in the United States of immigrants. Shiva is worshipped famously in the form of this ice lingam, which forms every year. Although climate change is actually affecting this, people understand this to be a representation of Shiva. So this guy has a plate with candles and flowers to be offered to it. And here's an example of some poetry from the early modern poetry of devotion to Ram. And I know the years there, I don't know if this is accurate, but he was a very long-lived poet, Tulsidas was, if these years are true. So he describes the flame offered to Ram, and this really shows devotional Hinduism as a kind of shortcut out of moksha. The flame offered to Ram extinguishes the flame of pain. It burns up sin and sorrow, burns down to the root of lust. In a lovely mist of incense, in a row of splendid lamps, its ritual rhythm, that is the flapping of the flame, the hand claps, scares the bird of sin away. It dissipates the darkness, the dumbness from the house, the heart, or of devotees. It casts wide the net of purest truth. I'm going to skip a couple lines. It is the messenger girl of liberation, embodied in a flash of lightning. So the gist of this poem is just lighting one candle to Ram is enough to get you moksha, right? You don't have to worry about laboring against sin and lust and whatever keeps you sucked into samsara, right? Just this one flame is enough to liberate you. All right, so there are different ways of integrating a lot of these paths. A lot of people have heard of Ashtanga yoga. It's a way of integrating Dharma, the Dharma Marga, Jnana Marga, and Bhakti as well. So I just like to see how a lot of people, you don't have to choose one path over the other, right? There are different ways of integrating them, and some people know about yoga here. But asana, this number 3, a lot of us have taken that as representative of all of yoga, right? When really it's part of a system that leads to liberation, especially through awareness of the self as Brahman. That is, the Atman is identical to the Brahman. All right. There's also the Tantric path, which is a movement that arose about the same time as Bhakti Marga. And here, this is a very more secretive tradition. But the idea here is you achieve instantaneous moksha through transgressive practices, all right? This could involve having a sexual relationship with a partner of a lower caste, eating forbidden foods, alcohol, but you make use of the material world and the senses in a particularly strong way. All right. So sometimes I'm not going to actually ask for a show of hands because we might be disclosing too much. But I like to think about which of these paths is most suited to you. Jnana, studying and acquiring wisdom. Karma, engaging in action without attachment to the fruits. Bhakti, that is cultivating a close and loving relationship with God. And Tantra, transgressing social norms and taboos. All right. So for me, when I think about all these multiple paths, the challenge, and as I'll just be honest, the challenge for me is it makes me wonder, is one lifetime enough? Like I kind of want to do all these paths, right? I want to walk them all. And it does give me the feeling that like there's a lot more to life than whatever number of years are most obviously available to me, right? So that's the real challenge for me as an Episcopal Christian. But the illumination for me is I kind of see my devotion to Jesus as a lot like a bhakti path, right? That it's sort of a shortcut, and it's like when karma gets too hard, right? The labor of trying to labor without attachment to the result, when the labor of meditation, feels like labor to me, and like gaining this knowledge, of my own nature, of the nature of God, of the nature of reality, that seems too hard. I can just like go for the devotional shortcut, right? And when I think about the kind of things that we see in Hindu worship, like flowers and incense and flames and songs and physical bowing, I think, wow, that looks a lot like Episcopal worship to me. And so just revaluing a lot of those things. Like for me, it isn't worship without flower. I have like a running controversy with members of my own, not immediate family, but extended family, about like whether churches should spend money on flowers. So, so this I'm like, yes, we should. It's part of the devotional path, right? So it's just giving me a new, context to how I understand the relationship with Jesus. And, people talk a lot about Jesus as the way, the truth, and the life, or way, truth, and life. And this is just me, but I'm like, I picture Jesus saying, hey, guys, I know a shortcut. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's just sort of what has been illuminating to me. My last one is very brief. It's just about goddesses. There are so many goddesses in Hindu tradition. In fact, there's two broad categories. They're not all nice, right? Some people say, like, well, Mary kind of is like a goddess. Well, not like some of these goddesses, all right? So two broad categories are goddesses of the tooth, who you can see here, many armed warriors, all kinds of wonderful, slay demons, all this wonderful stuff, don't have male consorts, right? They're independent. And then who they call goddesses of the breast. These are usually consort goddesses, wives of a particular god. They're nurturing, loving, etc. Two of my favorite goddesses from being in Nepal are the goddess Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth. I got to go participate in Lakshmi Puja at a Hindu friend's house, where every year you hope that she brings you money, and I've never worshipped with money. So, we have money here, too, but it was just more concrete than I expected. And Saraswati, the goddess of education. A lot of my students had notebooks with Saraswati on them, and before exams, they would go to a Saraswati temple, kind of for help with study. Here's Durga and Kali, just sort of famous, slaying goddesses of the tooth. Shiva, there's also these traditions of the goddess being more powerful than the god. Okay, so Shakti here there's sort of a dual Shiva and Shakti. Shakti is the feminine power of the god Shiva. And here we have the gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva paying honor to the great goddess Mahadevi. Okay, so devotees of the great goddess Devi or Mahadevi often represent her as more powerful than the others. Okay. The Ganges is sometimes worshipped as a goddess, and in Nepal, they have a tradition called Kumari of a living goddess. So that would be a young girl who's chosen from a village to be the embodiment of the goddess Kumari. She gets paraded around at festivals until she begins menstruation, and then they choose a new Kumari. Okay. So I never saw her, but I've been at festivals where she was, but she rarely peeks out of her little thing that she's carried around in. All right. So for me, the challenge is we just don't have this stuff, right, in Episcopal Christianity, right? There's a lack of feminine imagery for God, right? We can find some of it in the Bible, but it's like a stretch, But this is my little illumination. This is an image from a German manuscript of the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon, and it has Jesus and the church side by side. And when I saw this image in the manuscript, I thought, wow, they look an awful lot like some of those images of Shiva, Vishnu, et cetera, with their consort goddesses. So that's an entirely separate talk for me, but this is my own area of research, is representations and poetry and imaginings of the church as a feminine, almost goddess-like figure within Christianity. So I don't have a strong answer there, but it sort of inspired the way I think about church and some of my own research. So that's it for Hinduism. I'll stick around for several minutes if anyone would like questions or would like to ask questions. And otherwise, we'll be here for Buddhism next week.